Hi there, I'm nicodehaan, and welcome to Living a Primal Lifestyle, where we explore a return to a more balanced and natural wild world.
To recover our natural health and regain our rights and freedoms. I'm Ellen DeHaan.
It's a beautiful day in Durango, Colorado. Right now it's about 65 degrees, going up to, I think, mid-70s today.
80.
80. Ooh, it'll be hot now.
Summer.
Summer's here, yeah. Please subscribe to our YouTube and Odysee channels. Hit the follow button, hit the like button, help our channel grow. And we post on Facebook and LinkedIn also. So if you hit the link below the show notes, you can maximize your nutrition with products from Mother Earth Labs. These are products that we use for our diet.
Show them the ticker.
Oh, the sticker. I always forget that. Yeah, hit that button and then yeah, there it is, Mother Earth Labs. Yeah, so these are the products that we use, and check them out, and I think you'll like that stuff. And if you have any comments or questions, you can reach me at nicodehaan@me.com, or just post in the
Comments.
the comment section.
Mhm.
Okay. Good. So let's start off. We're talking about fat today.
Now we've touched on this subject, but this article was a very nice summary, just to remind everybody the whole history of.
Yeah, and I had a lot of other articles that I was looking at, mostly mainstream news stuff, and that's the stuff we really don't listen to. And they're talking about what not to eat, and mostly it's saturated fat. And
mostly it's meat.
Yeah, don't eat meat and don't eat saturated fat, which comes from meat.
We decided that we're giving up on posting mainstream stuff if it doesn't agree with the research and so on.
Yes,
and we're just going to give you just the information that we follow, and
at least today. This article is from the National Institute of Health.
Yeah.
And it's a short history of saturated fat and the making and unmasking of the making and unmaking or unmasking, I guess. Of scientific consensus. My reading's not that good.
So the idea that saturated fat caused heart disease, that's called the diet-heart hypothesis, was introduced in the 1950s based on weak associational evidence.
Yeah, subsequent clinical trials attempting to substantiate this hypothesis could never establish a causal link.
Yeah, it's a common problem when there's any kind of it's like what we were talking about with if you see a bridge and the bridge got tagged by somebody with the date 2025, then you say, oh, that person built the bridge.
Yeah, that's the way they do it in Egypt anyway.
Yeah. Right. So the point is that there's a very big difference between association and causation.
Yeah, so it says here, however, these clinical trial data were largely ignored for decades until journalists brought them to light about a decade ago. Subsequent re-examinations of this evidence by nutritional experts have now been published in over 20 review papers, which have largely concluded that saturated fats have no effect on cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular mortality, or total mortality.
The current challenge is for this new consensus on saturated fats to be recognized by policymakers who, in the United States, have shown a marked resistance to the introduction of the new evidence. In the case of the 2020 dietary guidelines, experts have been found even to deny their own evidence.
Yeah, the global reevaluation of saturated fats that has occurred over the past decade implies that caps on these fats are not warranted and should no longer be part of the national dietary guidelines.
Conflicts of interest and longstanding biases stand in the way of updating dietary policy to reflect the current evidence.
Yeah, so the concept that saturated fat causes cardiovascular disease by raising serum cholesterol is called the diet-heart hypothesis, a highly influential idea that has been a linchpin of nutritional policy for over 60 years. The hypothesis remains today a foundation of public health policy, with nearly all dietary guidelines worldwide recommending a cap on saturated fat consumption as a primary measure of protection against heart disease.
Over the past 12 years, however, there has been a major shift in scholarly understanding of these fats. And with more than 20 review papers by independent teams of scientists, on the whole, concluding that saturated fats had no effect on major cardiovascular outcomes, including heart attacks, strokes, or cardiovascular mortality, or total mortality from any other causes.
Yeah, national dietary guidelines have not recognized this new thinking on saturated fats, however, and continue to promote policies based on outdated or insufficient evidence.
Yeah, there's some key.
And especially in mainstream news, because the mainstream news is largely funded by the
pharmaceutical
companies.
Yeah, we noticed the other day we don't listen to the commercials. If we can fast forward through them, we do. But we did notice sometimes we can't. We just turn off the sound, and there's ads for pharmaceutical products for medication to address type 2 diabetes, which is an obesity that's caused by it's diet related and it occurs later in life. Although these days you're finding type 2 diabetes in children as well because of poor eating. And we noticed that not one of those ads references the fact that you could change your diet and help treat your type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, in fact, we were watching a ad for Lucky Charms the other day, which I hadn't seen in years. It was, cereals. Basically cereals. We don't see much advertising anymore.
No,
but all of a sudden,
we used to be Tony the Tiger with Frosted Flakes everywhere. All the kids programs on Saturday morning and so on.
Yeah.
Now, but we did notice that the ads for these magical drugs that are supposed to control type 2 diabetes, again, they don't mention anything about modifying your diet, and the people they show in the ads are definitely overweight according to the standards that they fall into the obesity category. Yeah. And so there's key points here in the article that say. First one is the large clinical trials on saturated fats do not provide support for the idea that these fats cause heart disease. And the most rigorous evidence on saturated fats showing that they did not cause heart disease was long suppressed or ignored. And the current 10% cap on saturated fats that's set forth by the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans is not supported by the preponderance of the evidence.
Yeah, so how did this all start? The diet heart hypothesis was first proposed in the 1950s by Ancel Keys,
physiologist at the University of Minnesota.
Yeah, he was interested in nutrition, and Keys based his idea on a handful of small feeding experiments conducted on humans, together with some animal data suggesting that high blood cholesterol caused fatty deposits of the type thought to clog arteries and cause heart attacks.
And Keys had further observed on travels through post-war Europe, less wealthy populations in Sardinia, Naples, and Spain appeared to suffer lower rates of heart attacks while consuming diets low in saturated fat-rich foods, such as meat and dairy.
Yeah, Keys postulated that the saturated fat and cholesterol caused heart disease, his diet heart hypothesis, whose claims he asserted in no fewer than 20 papers from 1957 to 1958.
He's been widely described by his colleagues as having a highly persuasive, even aggressive personality, and these attributes may have in part allowed him to ensure that his idea edged out the competing hypotheses to become the dominant paradigm explaining cardiovascular disease for the next 70 years.
Yeah. So, one authority whom Keys successfully won over was Paul Dudley White, an influential cardiologist and the personal doctor for the President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I remember that time was in the mid-50s. Mm-hmm. And it was just, that's when it started, when he endorsed it.
He started preaching it to the president and so on. And then the second authority that adopted this diet heart hypothesis had ultimately more enduring influence, it was the American Heart Association, the nation's largest nonprofit organization and long a respected leader in the field of heart disease. And Dr. Paul Dudley White was an AHA founder.
Yeah, and Eisenhower hosted fundraisers for this group in the White House. And I think that's what I probably remember.
Yeah.
Throughout the 1950s, the American Heart Association has resisted giving advice on heart disease prevention, citing a lack of evidence. Yet in 1960s, Keyes was appointed to the group's nutritional committee, and 1 year later, although no greater evidence could be cited, he had convinced his colleagues to recommend his idea as official American Heart Association policy.
And from 1961 on, the American Heart Association recommended all men and subsequently women decrease their consumption of saturated fat, replacing these fats whenever possible with polyunsaturated vegetable oils as the most promising measure of protection against heart disease. And the 1961 American Heart Association advice to limit saturated fat is arguably the single most influential nutrition policy ever published, as it was then adopted first by the US government as official policy for all Americans in 1980, and then by governments around the world as well as the World Health Organization.
Yeah, it's amazing because there's an old story, an Indian story. I think Russell Means told this story at one time when I was watching an interview by him, that if you take a wild wolf and you put him in a cage, he never stops trying to get out of that cage. He's always gnawing at something and trying to get out. But his pups, who would be born in the cage, would not be trying to get out because that's where they were born. And from 1950s on, this whole paradigm shift of not eating meat has been in our culture, even though there's much more evidence stating that's not the case.
Yeah, and let's keep going here.
And look at our population now. Look at, you can go anywhere and take a look at a picture from the 1950s, people on the beach, and they're all thin.
Mm-hmm.
And now if you take that same picture, it's a completely different story.
Yeah, well, it's worth noting that the American Heart Association had a significant conflict of interest, and this is a recurring theme in all of these different studies that were done to prove Ansel Keys right. They had in 1948, it received $1.7 million, or in today's dollars, about $20 million from Procter & Gamble, the makers of Crisco oil. This donation was transformative for the American Heart Association, and it propelled what was a small group into a national organization. The Procter & Gamble funds were the bang of big bucks that launched the group, according to the organization's own official history.
Yeah, vegetable oils such as Crisco, and I think Crisco at first was cottonseed oil, and then they changed it to some corn oil or.
Oh, at first they had some lard in it, I think. At the beginning,
in the old days,
in the very beginning, yeah.
So vegetable oils such as Crisco have reaped the benefits of this recommendation ever since, as Americans increased their consumption of these oils by nearly 90% from 1970 till probably present day.
Yeah, and I know that my mother used Crisco all the time. It was inexpensive.
Yep.
And it was, people thought it was healthy.
Yeah.
So then came the 7 countries study.
So at first he had 20 countries, and then he whittled it down to 7.
You're talking about Keys, Ansel Keys.
Yeah, yeah.
And he whittled it down to 7 because those 7 supported his theory, his hypothesis, while the others didn't. The other 13 did not. And so he did not include places like Germany, Switzerland, and France, where people ate a great deal of saturated fat, but experienced rates of heart disease similarly low to those included in the original 7 countries study.
Key's selection of nations has given rise to the critique that he cherry-picked countries to prove his hypothesis, which clearly he did. Yeah. While defenders of the study have attempted to dismiss this allegation, it remains true that Keyes used a non-random approach for his selection of these countries.
And then that allowed for the introduction of bias and for skewed results. I mean, it's in 1989, a reanalysis of the SBS data by some of the original study researchers found that coronary mortality best correlated not with saturated fats, as originally reported, but with sweets defined as sugar products and pastries.
High processed carbohydrates, right?
Uh-huh.
Possibly the correlation would have been even stronger if the sweets category had included chocolate, ice cream, and soft drinks, but the researchers said data on these items was too difficult to
Well,
combine.
how do you do sweets without doing ice cream or soft drinks? I mean, really, that's just ludicrous.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the principal limitation of the 7-country study was that they could only show an association but no cause and effect relationship. And the results have never been independently analyzed. And most subsequent studies using similar approaches have failed to confirm even the STS data.
Yeah, and we're still using these studies today to.
Well, somebody is.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Governments around the world, including the United States, Norway, Finland, and Australia, among other countries, recognize the need for more rigorous clinical trial data that could establish a causal relationship between saturated fat and heart disease.
And large randomized controlled clinical trials were undertaken in the 60s and 70s in which saturated fats were replaced by polyunsaturated fats from vegetable oils. And altogether, these core trials tested the diet heart hypothesis on about 67,000 people and were especially important because they assessed long-term clinical outcomes, such as heart attacks and death. And these outcomes are considered more reliable for making public health policy compared to studies that use intermediary endpoints such as cholesterol or inflammatory measures, whose value for predicting the cardiovascular events is highly disputed.
Yeah, so these trials provided surprisingly little support for the diet heart hypothesis. Dramatic reductions in the consumption of saturated fat has successfully lowered the patient's cholesterol by an average of about 29 milligrams per
Deciliter.
Indicating a high level of compliance among subjects, according to one analysis. Yet the expected reductions in either cardiovascular or total mortality were not observed in most trials.
In other words, although the diet could successfully lower blood cholesterol, the reduction did not appear to translate into long-term cardiovascular gains.
Yeah, and now we know one of the benefits of eating saturated fat, that it raises our good cholesterol.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. And then.
Exactly. So by the late 1960s, the bias in favor of the diet heart hypothesis was strong enough that researchers with contrary results found themselves unable or unwilling to publish their results.
And that's pretty well. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah,
about what's going on right now?
Exactly.
Okay, for instance, the largest test of the diet heart hypothesis, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, which involved 9,057 men and women over a period of 4.5 years, tested a diet of 18% saturated fats against controls that ate 9%. But it did not find any reduction in cardiovascular events, deaths, or total mortality.
Yeah, and although the study had been funded by the National Institute of Health,
National, not the natural.
Naturally, the results were not published for 16 years after the principal investigator, Yvan France, had retired. France is reported to have said that there is nothing wrong with the study. We were just disappointed in the way it came out.
Yeah, well, they didn't like the results, so they didn't publish it.
Right.
It didn't uphold the narrative, you know. France's decision not to publish his results in a timely manner resulted in this contradictory data not being considered for another 40 years.
Yeah, there's other results that went unpublished where one of the most famous heart disease investigations ever undertaken was in
the Framingham
Heart Study, beginning in 1948 by Vanderbilt University.
Vanderbilt University professor George Mann led a dietary investigation collecting detailed food consumption data from 1,049 subjects. He calculated the results in 1960, and it was very clear that saturated fat was not related to heart disease.
Yeah, concerning the incidence of coronary heart disease and diet, the authors concluded simply no relationship found.
However, not until 1992 did a Framingham study leader publicly acknowledge the study's findings on fat.
Yeah.
In,
The more saturated fat one ate, the lower the person's serum cholesterol, and they weighed the least, according to William.
according to one of the directors
Yeah.
who was involved in this study.
So, as a consequence of the non-publication or disregard of the study findings, contrary to the diet heart hypothesis, the idea that saturated fat had possibly been unduly vilified was for decades not seriously considered by most experts. This just keeps going on and on and on.
The earliest formal analyses of the early data on saturated fats were led by Ronald M. Krauss, who was a cardiologist and nutrition expert, and he published 2 papers in 2010 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. He experienced formidable hurdles in the peer review process due to widespread resistance to reevaluating the hypothesis.
A colleague of Keyes attempted to rebut these papers. Yet soon afterwards, other scientists joined Krauss in reassessing the same data.
Results from the core trials have now been analyzed extensively by scientists worldwide, including by the prestigious Cochrane Group, most recently in 2020. Altogether, more than 20 review papers, including umbrella reviews, have been published, with the vast majority concluding that the data from randomized controlled trials did not provide consistent or adequate evidence for continued recommendation limiting the intake of saturated.
And yet, it's still going on.
Oh, yeah, it's still going on in the mainstream, and the narrative is official, and, kind of pushing don't eat meat and eat vegetables and plants.
Yeah. There's a couple.
Overall, despite extensive testing of the diet heart hypothesis, the data did not support continued advice to restrict the fats for the purpose of preventing heart
disease. Yeah. And so we have the U.S. dietary guidelines on saturated fat. The U.S. government was the first in the world to recommend saturated fat restrictions. United States Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs published the dietary goals for the United States in 1977, which recommended that the public reduce saturated fat consumption to account for about 10% of total intake.
The report was heavily influenced, imagine that, by experts from the American Heart Association. It was written by a single Senate staffer who had no background in science or nutrition.
Yeah, an early draft of the report further recommended that people decrease consumption of meat.
Yeah.
Based on the saturated fat content. Yeah. This advice was revised to read, choose meat which will reduce saturated fat intake.
So there you get your lean meat.
Yes.
Some observers have interpreted this revision to be exclusively due to the interference of the meat industry. Yet in a 2014 article in the American Journal of Public Health that examined the Senate committee process in detail, concluded that a lack of scientific consensus was the principal reason for the change in language on meat. And the latter interpretation also reflects the absence of rigorous data linking saturated fats to heart disease, as we've mentioned above.
Yeah.
And then we had what is this? Let's see, 1980, and then being published again every 5 years.
Every 5 years.
Dietary guidelines for Americans called the DGA.
Yeah, according to the U.S. law, the DGA must reflect the preponderance of the scientific and medical knowledge which is current at the time the report is prepared.
So the subject of saturated fats presents a unique difficulty, however, since the original core trials concluded before the guidelines were started.
Yeah, a review of all the DGA expert reports found that none of the expert committees appointed to review the science of the new edition of the guidelines had ever undertaken a direct systematic review of these core trials on saturated fats. The guidelines have simply inherited the widely held view that saturated fats were linked to cardiovascular disease without its own novel review of the science.
Yeah,
and that's where we pretty much stand today.
Yeah, I mean, there's something called, let's see, the growing awareness of the core trials from the year 2010 onwards should arguably have spurred one of the subsequently Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committees, DGAC, to initiate a systematic review of the major trials, but none occurred. And I mean, it just goes on and on. And
Yeah,
and
there's a
it's-
conclusion here I'd like to read at the end.
yeah,
So,
just 1 second
Yep.
here. I wanna just point out that the DGAC final report in 2020 made no mention of any shift in scientific thinking on the fats and concludes that the evidence linking them to heart disease is in fact strong. But an analysis of the 2020 DGAC subcommittee in charge of the saturated fat review found numerous intellectual, financial, and even religious conflicts of interest that may have contributed to the bias against saturated fats. I think there's no mayhem involved here. One member was found to have chaired 5 vegetarian conferences from 1997 to 2018. And this member was also found to have been receiving funds from 7 soy and tree nut industry groups. And then another member had spent the last 50 years of her career working as a lead investigator on some of the government's largest trials, attempting to show that fat and saturated fats were bad for health. And a third member is part of a vegetarian activist group which condemned the evolving science on saturated fats. I mean, there's just no question that there was no independent thinking going on.
not at all. No, it's all follow the money. So the conclusion: for decades following the introduction of the diet heart hypothesis, many scientists were unaware of the lack of evidence for this theory. However, the rediscovery of rigorous clinical trials tested this hypothesis, and the subsequent publication of multiple review papers on this data have provided new awareness of the fundamental inadequacy of the evidence to support the idea that saturated fats cause heart disease.
The observed resistance against considering this new science by successive DGACs can potentially be seen as reflecting long-standing biases in the field and the influence of vested interests. Until the recent science on saturated fats is incorporated into the U.S. dietary guidelines, the policy on this topic could not be seen as evidence-based.
Yeah,
That's
pretty disturbing stuff.
Yeah, I just thought that was a really good summary of the history and how we got here and what's been going on.
Yeah, so the next article, let me get to it right here. It is the Healthy Fats in an Ancestral Diet, Complete Guide.
Now, this was interesting, and the author is Jim Jackson. He published it on his website. Not sure who he is.
Yeah.
Okay, until he was 36, he thought he should avoid saturated fats. Eating animal fat was for those who didn't care about their health, beer guzzling, junk food eating, cigarette chuffing kind of people.
The problem was I was eating well and I wasn't getting healthy.
Meaning the author.
Yeah, I was chronically fatigued. That was until I listened to a podcast that said animal fats are healthy and I should be eating them.
He said he was desperate for some relief from the misery that he was living, which included lethargy, brain fog, anxiety, and most of all, deep, dark depression.
So he says, I stopped eating human-made foods, including the seed oils, and started eating animal fats.
His meals went from pesto pasta to ribeye steak cooked in butter, and then from a ham salad to a mayo sandwich, and mayo sandwich to scrambled eggs, bacon, cream, and loads of butter.
Yeah, he says that within days, my symptoms started to disappear. I was no more than 2 weeks in, and I felt this light bulb that had switched on my head, and one that hadn't been there on for a long time. We kind of felt the same way when we switched our diet, didn't we?
Yeah, it made a big difference right away, very, very quickly. And then he said it became clear to him that animals and their fats have existed for millions of years, and human-made seed oils were only recently invented.
So it makes sense that humans would struggle with something we've never been eating before. And when we introduced back the fats our ancestors ate, we would start thriving again.
So then he started thinking about it and said, well, then he got angry and he said, how could we have been led down in such a destructive path? We put a faith in the advice we were given, but it was so clearly wrong. And now that we know that what healthy fats are, Then he wanted to explore their role in the ancestral diets and their benefits and how to incorporate them into our modern lives.
Yeah, he says you'll learn why fats like grass-fed butter, pastured animal fats, and wild-caught fish are essential for long health.
So he says healthy fats such as
Animal fats.
animal fats and cold pressed oils have fueled humans for millennia. They support energy, brain health, hormone production, and overall vitality.
Our ancestors thrive on fats from animal meats, organs, wild-caught fish, and location-based oils like olive and coconut oil, which are unprocessed and nutrient-dense.
Modern processed foods, seed oils, and refined sugars disrupt health. Returning to ancestral whole foods reduce inflammation and restores metabolic balance.
Healthy fats strengthen immunity, improve cardiovascular health, and reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, chronic disease. They offer sustainable energy and long-term wellness.
Yeah, it says healthy fats are natural animal fats that support bodily functions and overall health. And unlike processed seeds, oils, and trans fats, these fats have been part of the human diet for thousands of years.
Fats are much more than this annoying little thing that hangs around the midriff. They have roles in the body that go way beyond energy.
And the body roles that he lists in the article are energy production,
hormone protection,
production,
and brain health.
Yeah, I mean, and then the ancestral sources he lists are animal fats, seafood, dairy, and plant-based oils.
And this is kind of the order that I look at it too. So I'm eating mostly animal fats from ruminant animals.
Mhm.
We eat a little bit of seafood.
Mhm.
We have a little dairy now and then.
And very often it's goat milk instead of cow's milk.
Yeah, things like that. And we have some cheeses and things like that.
Right.
And then we do eat some plant-based oils like
Olive oil.
Yeah, olive oil and some other oils also.
Yeah. Mhm.
So healthy fats in the ancestral diets, imagine yourself as a hunter-gatherer, and your number one stressor and job for the day is to find food for yourself and for your tribe.
Yeah, so as you walk across the plains, you see an elk in the distance, your prayers are answered. You chase the beast and secure the kill using the skills and knowledge passed down from your elders and gained over the years. So today, you and your tribe will eat well.
Not only that, it's the adventure of.
Oh yeah,
now we use this
accomplishment.
Now this is our recreation in a sense.
Yeah, well, not and it's not that many people that can go out and actually hunt it.
No, I've been on a hunting trip once.
Yeah, so it says now, do you cut off the fat and throw it away? The stuff that makes the food taste a little bit better and make you feel full? Would you let anything go to waste, knowing that you might not eat again for a while?
Yeah.
So
animal fats have been part of the human diet for thousands of years. Before modern food systems, our ancestors hunted, fished, and foraged, relying heavily on nutrient-dense animal fats for survival.
And those fats were the source of calories for people to survive through long winters and food scarcity.
Yeah, so animal fats are rich in fat-soluble vitamins, which are probably the most important ones, A, D, E, and K2. These are necessary for strong bones, a robust immune system, and optimal organ functions. And if we look back and see most of the diseases today, they involve these three things: strong bones, the immune system, and your organs not failing.
Yeah. Unlike water-soluble vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins require dietary fat in order to be absorbed. So animal-based fats are essential to the ancestral diet.
Yeah, so what we've been doing really is ruining our health by staying away from these fats, because the vitamins and minerals that are essential to us, even though they may or may not be fat soluble, or they may be water soluble, still you need the fat to absorb them and use them.
Yeah.
So people who restrict the fats, especially saturated fat, you're not getting the vitamins. I don't care how you're taking these vitamins, whether you're taking them in supplements and the greatest supplements in the world, they're not going to be absorbed.
They're not equal to eating the actual.
Exactly.
And then it says that the next thing was organ meats and wild caught fish nutrients. And says organ meats like liver, heart, and kidneys were highly valued by our ancestors and are nutrient dense. Liver is one of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet, packed with vitamin A, iron, and minerals. And then it goes on to what's the difference between a modern diet versus an ancestral diet?
Yeah, so modern diets are dominated by ultra-high processed food filled with seed oils, refined sugars, and artificial additives. Seed oils like soybean, corn, and canola oil are highly processed and prone to oxidation and chronic inflammation. Most of these are already rancid before they're served.
When you buy
When you buy them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then chronic inflammation and metabolic health issues, the consuming of too much processed food, it leads to systemic inflammation, the root of many chronic diseases. Benefits of minimally processed foods.
Yeah, switching to minimally processed food, nutrient-dense food like ancestral diets will reduce these inflammations and stabilize your energy and improve your metabolic health. Eating whole, unprocessed foods will restore your body's natural balance and long-term health. You really don't need medications. You just need to change your diet.
If you do that, you can help.
And one of the key things I think too, Ellen, is that when we stopped eating the processed foods and switched over to animal-based, and now our diet, we've refined this over the last 20 some years, and we eat mostly meats and non-processed and a little seafood and a little bit of avocado and a few other types of oils, but no medications at all. And I'm in my 80s, and
and in a week I'll be 79.
You'll be 79. Yeah, so we're feeling really good, and it's so essential that later on in life that you feel great, because then you can do the things that you always wanted to do.
Yeah, well, and it's important to be able to get out of a chair, for goodness sakes, or walk,
or get off the floor without using your hands,
or get off the toilet
yeah.
without a grab bar.
Yeah.
It's important. It's about quality of life. It's not about looking like you're 20. It's about living with quality.
No, I want to look like I'm 80, but I want to look good at 80 too.
Right. Yeah. A really young looking 80. Yeah. Then it says the truth about seed oils. Are they healthy? And it says seed oils were not made for human consumption and are slowly poisoning anyone who eats them.
Yeah, seed oils like soybean oil, corn oil, canola are industrial products extracted with high heat and chemical solvents like hexene. And this process removes all the natural nutrients and creates unstable molecules that oxidize. Remember, these foods were never eaten by our ancestors.
No, but on top of which, soybeans and corn are often genetically modified these days and contain all kinds of strange things.
Another thing they do, of course, is they bleach and deodorize them because these smell bad and they look bad.
Yeah, right. They want to make them appealing for eating.
Yeah,
so it's not a food at all.
Yeah, and so seed oils are relatively a new addition to the human diet, introduced only in the last century, and we see what it's done to us.
Yeah,
the human body evolved to thrive on these natural fats and not chemically altered oils made in factories.
Yeah,
and I think the biggest problem today is when we go out to eat, anything that's fried is usually fried in some of these oils. Very seldom do.
Well, it's all the junk, all the inexpensive fast food.
Yeah. Well, that's for sure. But even at a good restaurant, they're probably not using olive oil might be a benefit, but
But you can't do too high of a heat with olive oil.
No, but extra virgin you can heat a little bit more, but generally they're not going to use them because they're very
more expensive.
Exactly right.
Yep. All right. So there's some more information here, and it talks about how the saturated fats are the myths around heart disease. And again,
about calorie intake.
We talked about the fact that there's no documentation, no proof, no trials that have ever shown an actual connection, that a causation between saturated fats.
Yeah, and we're also told that eating fat makes us fat. While fats are calorie dense, they're also very satisfying, keeping us full. So you really don't eat that much.
Right.
So what is actually happening is these refined carbohydrates are the ones that are actually
causing the problem.
And making us gain weight.
And it says the key is to eat natural fats and avoid processed artificial fats, which then disrupt the hormonal balance and trigger fat storage. So then it says, what are the health benefits of ancestral diets with healthy fats? And that would be a boost to your immune system and giving you more energy.
Cardiovascular health and weight loss.
Yeah.
Automatically. You don't have to go on a diet when you switch over.
Wow.
There's a little process that takes place depending how far you are in
what
diet.
Percentage of your diet is
if you've been eating really bad food for a long time, it takes your body a while to switch over. I think we switched over in less than 30 days. Because slowly our diet
like 10 days.
And you can
as soon as I stopped eating a bowl full of cereal for breakfast with soy milk, in 10 days I lost 2 inches of my waist, and it was the bloating from the food that was causing it.
And my stomach started feeling better.
Yeah, that was the very beginning. That was it. That was like the light bulb for us. Just noticing that right away. And it says that ancestral diets with anti-inflammatory fats can reduce the severity of autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, and lupus. Although the nutrient density of foods like organ meats and wild-caught fish also supports cellular repair and reduces chronic inflammation and can help prevent lifestyle diseases such as diabetes, type 2, metabolic syndrome, and certain types of cancer. So conclusion.
And another thing says cholesterol will go up. It's now understood that our body will make it if it
that's the point. If you don't eat if you limit your diet and don't eat cholesterol at all, your body still makes it. Because you need it.
Body's pretty smart. Conclusion. So the idea that animal fats are bad for you and we should replace them with human-made processed foods that humans have never been exposed to before is so harmful to our health.
A little common sense makes this obvious. Our ancestors ate animals and their fats for millions of years, and plant-based fats are a new invention.
Another thing that's been floating around in my head that the author says is the humans can store fat on their bodies forever. As annoying as this is, in our modern era of food aplenty, there must be an evolutionary reason for this.
In a time when food was scarce, it's very handy to have some reserve energy, and fat is a great energy source. So when you run on fat as your main fuel source, being in ketosis, which we've mentioned before, it's also as if we're designed to run on fat. And what would have been the only fat available until about 100 years ago? Animal fat.
Pretty much.
So that's a very interesting.
Well, there's another thing that too is if you're looking at the natural world, we're going to be looking at what time of the year do these fruits and vegetables appear.
Right, they're seasonal.
They're seasonal normally, and especially in a climate like ours, you're going to find these berries. Some of them, very few of them in the spring, but a lot of them in the fall.
All in the fall,
mostly. So, and that's the natural process. Now, when you found this other article, which is
we have one more article here, and basically it addresses the evolutionary impact of diet, which I thought was extremely interesting, and we're just going to touch on it. We had a little bit in the article before this one. It says our ancestors ate this way for years. So this one says you need to think about what you put on your plate. Thanks to the ways in which evolution has shaped human biology, it also matters what your mother and her mother ate, and what your own distant ancestors ate tens of thousands of years ago. So it was very interesting to read this. And
There is nothing inherently dangerous about saturated fat. After all, your pet cat could eat nothing but meat and fat and be perfectly healthy. As pure carnivores, the natural diets of all cats is very high in protein and saturated fat and low in carbohydrates. And cats have evolved uh, metabolisms that are well suited to processing this blend of nutrients.
and their cells preferentially use proteins as a source of energy, while the ability of those cells to use carbs, which are scarce in the cat diet, has been reduced. And that's why you find cats having urinary problems and dying early because of the carbohydrates, the
Dogs too.
fillers
Yeah.
in the food,
Yeah.
that they're being given.
Yeah.
And it says cats can tolerate high levels of protein and fat, but are prone to developing diabetes if they're fed a quantity of carbohydrates, which is kind of scary.
Yeah.
And says the same logic can be applied to human health.
Well, it's possible to know the diet of our. It's impossible to know our diet of our ancestors with certainty. There much can be inferred for sure.
Yeah,
Because-
and we know, for instance, for millions of years until the rise of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, humans and their ancestors subsisted by foraging on wild plants and animals. Wild plants tend to be high in fiber and low in simple sugars, and meat from wild animals is lean in comparison to domestic beef and also has a different fatty acid profile.
Yeah, and that's an interesting part too, because usually our ancestors, when we went out to hunt, we would pick naturally the fattest ones,
Mhm.
not the leanest ones.
Yeah,
So, and there's a
they
reason.
looked ill, or what our instincts were.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it says
But when you look at normal carnivores like lions and stuff like that, they're going to cull the herd with the weak ones, the slow ones. We don't. We look for the majestic, the leader of the pack, and things like that.
Yeah, well,
So we're always after the fat, always.
yeah. So it says our genetic makeup contains a memory of our ancestors' diets, and our bodies have been shaped by evolution to expect something similar. And as our modern diet deviates from the biological expectation, health problems emerge.
Yeah.
So, it's just thinking about what your grandmother ate, what your mother ate. You're in the womb, you're absorbing whatever your mother is eating, and that's your body becomes acclimated to it, and you kind of are predisposed to eat that way according to this.
Yeah, and coming from a different country too. I mean, we were really locked into what both my sister and I were locked into what my mother always ate. I didn't eat any lunches at schools. I didn't like them. So my
Your
mother,
palate was
my palate wasn't
accustomed.
accustomed to that.
Mhm.
And so my mother always fixed me, the liverwurst sandwiches and things like that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I left school that I started eating more of the American or Canadian style diet. And then my health really, even though I was young,
Change.
yeah. When I met you, that's when we were starting really looking into the how we were eating, and slowly but surely we caught on to what we were doing.
Yeah, so it's interesting because they talk about something called the evolution, the fetal development plasticity, where the fetus adapts in utero before they're born. And so, for example, some of the adjustments included a tendency to deposit more abdominal body fat, the blunted response of muscle to insulin that increases glucose in the bloodstream. And it could provide additional advantages after birth if the postnatal environment is also nutritionally stressful. And in this way, mothers could pass their biological memories reflecting their own lifetime of experiences of stress in the local environment along to their children, allowing developmental adjustments to be made in anticipation of stressful conditions after birth. So it's interesting that, I think about my mother. Okay. She grew up, she was born in 1917. She went through the Great Depression. I don't know what kind of food there was available for them. I don't know anything about their eating habits, but I'm, they ate what they could get or whatever. And, I know once I was a child old enough to understand what I was eating, it was always, some kind of meat or chicken or fish or whatever, and some kind of frozen vegetable that came in a plastic package. And so probably while it was being boiled was also getting all those nice forever chemicals in the peas,
Well,
and
and it makes me think of during the Second World War when I was born. My parents, of course, Holland was being occupied for about 2 years
Mhm.
with the Germans, and that's when the food was really very restricted.
Scarce.
Yeah, very scarce.
Mhm.
And it was during those 2 years that just about everybody in Holland lost their teeth,
Oh.
just in that 2 year period because of the lack of the nutrition that
Mhm.
was not.
And lack of dental care
Well,
availability
yeah,
and so
too,
on.
but
Yeah.
pretty much, I mean,
Mhm.
our ancestors had lack of dental care for thousands and
Oh,
thousands of
yeah,
years and
that's
didn't lose
true. And
their
they had
teeth.
beautiful teeth.
Exactly. So it was that definitely that lack of nutrition. There was nothing good available. Certainly no animal. All the animals were gone that first
Have
year.
been taken by the armies.
Yeah, and even slaughtered by the people
Right.
if they had their own
Okay.
animals.
Yeah, they had to eat.
So yeah. There's a section in here too that talks about the secondary explanation above, which is why specifically saturated fat that harm our health, even though these nutrients are perfectly healthy for carnivores.
It's a question of evolutionary origins or ultimate causation.
Yes, from an evolutionary perspective, focus on ultimate causes. Our current dietary problems are largely result of an interaction between two diets that typically are consumed by our ancestors.
The one that's typically consumed by our ancestors.
Yeah, which human metabolisms became adaptive to genetically over many thousands and millions of years, and the diet that many of us now consume, which is rapidly deviating from this ancestral. So the shift from that, like industrial agriculture and market capitalism, is what changed, and we haven't yet adapted to
Well,
that.
here's the thing, and the pace of human lifestyle change is radically fast. All things considered, the changes that occurred just from in our lifetime, let alone in our parents'
way too
lifetime,
fast.
went just incredibly fast. And but our genes don't adapt that quickly, so that's been a problem.
Yep.
And the genetic memory of past lifestyles, which set up our bodies to expect conditions similar to those experienced by our distant ancestors, is the ultimate cause of many current metabolic disease epidemics, including the recent rise in obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases, and widespread health problems like depression, myopia, nearsightedness, and allergy.
And there's another section in here that talks about the development of plasticity, why genes only loosely dictate our fate, the copy errors in DNA mutations that allow genetic adaptation to environmental conditions such as diet are rare. Thus, it takes many generations, and for a species with a long lifespan, many thousands of years for substantial genetic change to consolidate around new environmental challenges.
Yeah.
So it's a good article. I suggest people read it.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff in it.
Yeah.
And in the end, it says the health impacts of what you eat must be understood in light of not two, but at least three diets. First is the genetic memory of the diet of your distant ancestors, which is reflected in the architecture of a metabolism that expects nutrient intake to be consistent with our long evolutionary history of subsisting on foraged wild foods.
And the second is that a diet is your recent
Matrilineal
ancestors, your mother and grandmother, which helped shape the
intrauterine
environment that
nurtured.
nurtured you as a fetus and passed along the memory of relatively recent environmental conditions.
Yeah,
So it takes a really long time to change, and certainly most of these changes that we've seen has happened within our lifetime. And just like the wolf that's wild, trying to get out of its cage, that's you and I, because we knew what was there before. But the people who were born just 20 years ago, or even 30 or 40 years ago, that's half our lifespan, never knew any difference.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, isn't it? It's when you're born, the world around you is the normal world, and you don't have any framework for what happened 50 years or 1,000 years or 50,000 years ago, and you don't have any framework. The world has always been for you the way it was when you were born.
Yeah, and we've seen radical changes, especially the years we've been married. We've noticed huge changes, but they actually started in the 50s and 60s, just as these articles indicate.
Yeah, we didn't know anything about it. I mean, I remember going on a diet in 1974 and following the American Heart Association diet. And I remember also at one time going
and how hard it was.
Well, I lost weight.
Yes.
But I wasn't eating properly.
But you didn't feel that great either.
No.
Most of the time, dieting is hard.
And I didn't stick to it because it was
not natural.
It wasn't.
And how easy it is to stick with what we've been doing. Eating twice a day, eating a lot of animal food, and being very happy and not getting hungry at all.
Feeling good.
And after 4 o'clock, after we eat, we're not consuming anything else.
Assuming that we've had enough fat with the dinner.
Yeah, sometimes we have some crackers and butter.
Yeah, because for whatever reason there wasn't that much fat on the meat, so we don't feel satisfied. But the butter takes care of it.
Anyway, well, we've gone longer than we usually go.
No,
anyway,
we're right on time. We're 56.
It's always right on time, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Thanks for sticking around, folks. So we appreciate it.
Be well and be safe.
Bye-bye now.